Last time, we told you horror punk was born in a New Jersey garage in 1977, and someone in the comments called us out. They were right. Welcome back. I'm Taz, and tonight we go deeper. Because it turns out the monster has a family tree, and it stretches back way further than any of us expected. Sit down. This one starts in 1956. The Misfits didn't invent horror punk out of thin air. Nobody does. Every genre is built on the bones of something that came before, and horror punk is no different. What Glenn Danzig and Jerry Only did in 1977 was take 30 years of weird, theatrical, horror-obsessed music and crystallize it into something new. But those 30 years, that's the story we didn't tell, until now. Let's go back to 1956. Rock and roll is brand new, still dangerous, still making parents nervous. And one man looks at this brand new genre and thinks, I can make this so much weirder. His name is Screaming Jay Hawkins. And when he released I Put a Spell on You that year, he didn't just record a song, he created a persona. Jay Hawkins performed Rising Out of a Coffin. He wore a bone through his nose, carried a skull on a stick he called Henry, and screamed and howled his way through performances like a man genuinely possessed. He was doing shock rock before shock rock had a name. Nobody knew what to do with him. Radio banned him. Audiences were half terrified, half completely obsessed. Sound familiar? Then there was Screamin Lord Sutch, a British rocker who leaned so hard into the horror theatrics that he made Hawkins look restrained. Sutch performed as Jack the Ripper. He entered stages in a coffin. He had dancers in monster costumes. In 1961, this man was putting on a full horror theatrical production at live shows while the Beatles were still playing Hamburg clubs. He never had a massive hit. He didn't need one. He planted a seed. And then there's Arthur Brown. 1968, Fire hits the charts, and suddenly here's a man performing with a flaming helmet on his head, screaming, I am the god of hellfire, at the top of his lungs on mainstream television. The normies were horrified. A certain kind of kid watching from the couch was absolutely electrified. These three men, Hawkins, Sutch, Brown, formed the first generation. They proved something important, that horror and rock and roll weren't just compatible, they were magnetic. Audiences couldn't look away even when they wanted to. And tucked in between all of this, almost lost to history, are a handful of strange rockabilly singles from the late 50s and early 60s that leaned hard into horror imagery. Songs about monsters, werewolves, and the supernatural delivered over twangy guitars and slap bass. Most of these artists were one-hit wonders or no-hit wonders, but they were part of the same cultural current, this persistent, irresistible pull toward making rock music scary. Horror wasn't a detour from early rock and roll. It was always part of its DNA. Now we get to the artist who took everything Hawkins, Sutch, and Brown built and scaled it to arenas, Alice Cooper. By the early 1970s, Alice Cooper had turned horror theatrics into a full production, guillotines, electric chairs, fake blood, boa constrictors. He made it impossible to ignore. And crucially, he made it commercially viable. If Screamin Lord Sutch proved you could do horror rock, Alice Cooper proved you could get rich doing horror rock. That permission mattered enormously for every artist who came after. Then punk arrives, late 1970s. Everything gets stripped back, raw, aggressive, and most punk bands ran as far from theatrical horror as they could. Punk was supposed to be real, not costume drama. But not the Damned. The Damned's vocalist Dave Vanian showed up to the punk scene dressed as a vampire, full gothic aesthetic, slicked back hair, deathly pale. While the Sex Pistols were doing working class rage, Vanian was doing something stranger and more theatrical. The Damned became the bridge between punk's raw energy and the horror aesthetic that had been bubbling since the 50s. And then there are the Cramps, possibly the most important band in this entire story that most people have never heard of. The Cramps took the forgotten horror rockabilly of the late 50s, smashed it into punk rock, added a sleazy B-movie sensibility, and created something called psychobilly before anyone had a name for it. Their live shows were legendary, raw, transgressive, genuinely unhinged. Lux Interior and Poison Ivy built a world that horror punk would later move into and call home. The Rezillos were doing something adjacent, more sci-fi and B-movie comic book than outright horror, but operating from the same instinct. That rock and roll was more fun, more alive, more itself, when it had one foot in the fantastical and the weird. By the late 70s, all of these threads are live wires lying on the same floor. Someone just needed to connect them. Enter the Misfits. 1977, New Jersey. We covered this last time, but now you understand what they were actually doing. They weren't inventing something from nothing. They were the synthesis. They took Screaming Jay Hawkins' horror persona, Screamin Lord Sutch's theatrical commitment, Alice Cooper's shock value, the Damned's punk energy, and the Cramps' B-movie obsession, and they compressed it all into something fast, catchy, and ferocious. Horror punk, as a distinct genre, crystallizes right there. But here's what that same commenter pointed out that stopped us in our tracks. At almost exactly the same moment, something else was crystallizing too. Goth. By 1980, 1981, bands like Susie and the Banshees, Bauhaus, and the Sisters of Mercy were emerging from post-punk with dark aesthetics, gothic imagery, and a theatrical sensibility that owes a direct debt to every artist we've talked about today. Bauhaus literally opened their career with a song called Bela Lugosi's Dead, 9 minutes of vampiric post-punk recorded in one take. Horror punk and goth are siblings, born from the same parents, Hawkins, Sutch, Brown, Cooper, Vanian, the Cramps. They just took different roads. Horror punk kept the energy aggressive and the imagery pulpy and fun. Goth got slower, darker, more atmospheric and romantic. By 1984, goth had taken over the underground scene, and horror punk had gone deeper into its own mythology. Two children of the same monster, and neither of them would exist without those first weird kids in the 1950s who decided rock and roll should be terrifying. So the next time someone tells you horror punk started with the Misfits, you can tell them the full story. It started with a man rising from a coffin in 1956, carrying a skull named Henry, and screaming at an audience that had no idea what they were watching. Everything else is product next. That's all for tonight. Taz is going back in the coffin. But before I do, drop a comment. Who did we miss? And if you want to know where horror punk and goth went after 1984, subscribe, because that story's coming.